I guess I should say it's a pleasure to be online, at least resume some version of normalcy here, given the circumstances when we started the Minerva Center for the research of the study of the rule of law under extreme conditions. We really didn't anticipate, I think. Please, founding members, correct me if I'm wrong. We really didn't anticipate the extent to which this topic will not only be relevant, but will also affect us personally in many ways of our lives. And I think the recent month or so, or 6 weeks, 40 days, whatever, yet again reaffirmed this, I guess, this sense. And we are very much aware that as we have been studying more recently, extreme conditions are often not isolated silos. So they either cascade or are in a relation to other types of either disasters or crises or stress points, depending on the definitions. I want to also mention that not everybody can be here. At least some of our PIs are not available because of the situation at the moment. But at least we can convene online. The Haifa University is still closed for business. I'm here, but school is still being held via Zoom. Okay, so enough of this introduction, but it does give us context, as should the more hopeful news from Hungary about the elections there. It remains to be seen to what extent the new regime will indeed fulfill its commitments to rejoin the European path, but at least as far as democratic decline or erosion is concerned, I think the news are positive. Without further ado, I want to introduce very briefly our two speakers of the day. Our very dear colleague Nadav Dagan is a research fellow here and has been for quite some time now. He is also a teaching fellow at the University of Haifa and a senior researcher at the Israeli Democracy Institute. He does research on public law and democracy, focusing on democratic discretion and constitutional change, and more recently on the notion of autocratization, which is the subject matter, the topic of today's conversation. And he will be joined by Advocate Daphne Benvenisty, who's a researcher also at the Israel Democracy Institute, and she also researches constitutional law, focusing on anti-democratic legislation, states of emergency, and then the notion of democratic backsliding from a comparative perspective. We usually try to keep the introductions kind of short. So without further ado, Nadav and Daphne, I leave the floor to you, or the virtual floor to you. I think you should be co-hosts so you can share your slides. Please, we're looking forward.
Thank you, Amnon. So we're very excited to present this research today. It's for the first time. It's the first time we present it here. So this is a research that we carried out as the Israel Democracy Institute, and we're very thankful for the opportunity to conduct it and present it today. Here comes the disclaimer. Although the research was conducted at the Israel Democracy Institute and published by the Israel Democracy Institute, and Daphne and I are both affiliated with the Institute. Everything we're going to say today is our views, our analysis, and our conclusions, rather than by no means a formal position of the institute as such. Okay, so I'm going to say a few words about the two phenomena at issue today, autocratization and states of emergency, and explain what brought us to focus, to research on the intersection of the two, to explore them together, not separately, and then and how we did it, and then the crux of the research, the study itself will be introduced by Daphne, the research of each country, and our findings and conclusions and discussion. So first, can you see the slides moving? So first, by saying autocratization, just to be on the same page, I'll do it briefly. I'll try, because I know that most of you are familiar with the terms. So we're referring to a gradual, incremental, prolonged process of regime change. It takes years, not days, not months. It takes years, and it's in essence a regime on the move. It's a motion, it's a direction from an ideal type democracy or any kind of democracy towards an ideal type autocracy. It's the opposite of democratization, which is a motion from ideal type autocracy or some point on the continuum, but autocracy, towards ideal type democracy. And autocratization is by definition, our definition as we use it, is led by politicians, by elected politicians that head the executive, usually president or cabinet, depends on the system. And in the end, democracy is, or the process is of dismantling democracy step by step, but simultaneously. Many steps are taken simultaneously, so actually it's not a step by step as many presented but rather batch by batch. Okay, batch of steps with batch of steps. We see multiple steps every day. That each one of those steps, at least almost all of them, are not fatal in and of themselves. So it's not that one step is going to eliminate democracy alone, in isolation, but rather when they accumulate. What are those types of steps in the most general terms? Abuse of power. And by saying abuse of power, I also include here governmental acts that are ultra vires. So for us, the lawyers, they're not a real power invested in office holder, but in general abuse of power. Normative changes, so constitutional replacement, constitutional amendment, significant constitutional amendments, legislative changes, and no less important, breaches and abandonment of conventions that are not written norms or codified norms, but important norms for the democratic environment, the democratic system. Another type of steps, that anti-democratic steps, that in my view is perhaps the most pivotal, is institutional hijack. So it's a process of taking a democratic institution, state institution, and turning it gradually into a tool, instrument, or in the service of the ruler or the ruling country, if it's not a single ruler. It's done mostly usually by, in all types of organizational means, but mostly appointments, dismissals, and conversion of current staff. And we also see deep societal transformation of the economy, of the media, the whole environment or ecosystem. We're not going to elaborate on that today, or to some extent, but not in the introduction. And a crucial element in autocratization, in contemporary autocratization, is the pretense of legitimacy. So those contemporary autocratizers make prodigious efforts to manufacture, maintain, and preserve a facade of legitimacy, electoral legitimacy, legal legitimacy, and to an extent, also professional legitimacy. They are, according to them, democrats. In fact, some of them would say they are the real democrats, unlike those liberals and so on. And so how they create this facade of legality? By state institutions that are being hijacked or captured, and the whole environment that they create, such as media, that is being in the gradually in the service. Professor Shayo from Hungary call it ruling by cheating. So it's an apparatus of creating misleading misrepresentations. So in sum, the outcome in our context, most pertinent in our context, that we have this process create damaged or insufficient system of checks and balances. In the most severe cases, lack of checks and balances, the non-existent. We cannot count on democratic resilience as we used to before autocratization, or regardless of autocratization. We have to take that into account, and we face, those countries face severe information and knowledge problems, because professional institutions, epistemic institutions, and the whole environment, the whole governmental apparatus that's supposed to give us reliable information is being transformed into something that is not professional, not reliable, not committed to the law or professional standards. Again, gradually, it's on a continuum, but rather committed to the rulers or the ruling country. And sometimes, or usually, it means to withhold information, to give inaccurate information, to give false information. Okay. So that's in very brief. Now, states of emergency, even more brief. We don't have, like we, the academic, the scientific community, don't have general, accepted, and good enough definition, general definition of states of emergency. But generally, we can say that states of emergency are designed, supposed to be conservative in nature, in their nature. So the core objective or the core essence of state of emergency is self-preservation of a particular organized society. So it's not a preservation of society, of an abstract society, but of particular society. In other words, self-preservation of state and the regime, self-preservation of democracy. So states of emergency are basically designed to protect the democratic state. And potentially, according to wider understandings of the definition, maybe also other objectives, such as prevention of massive loss of lives and so on. But the most fundamental idea is to preserve the state and its democratic form of government. Here, we have to consider the core traits of states of emergency. So first, we know that in state of emergency, the public, the state, turn to the executive and ask them, save us from an external threat, from the war, from the pandemic, from the earthquake, or any kind of natural disaster. For that, we entrust extra power with you. So in times of emergency, we see executive aggrandizement, what we usually perceive as the appropriate, justified division of power is changed. So more power to the executive, less checks and balances. So it's unconventional and unchecked or less checked and less reviewed power. We see swift and decisive actions. So that's one of the main ideas, to act swiftly, to act fast. As Prime Minister Netanyahu famously demonstrated on TV, we act like that. Like that. So lockdowns, regulations, confinements, quarantines, it all happens in a day or in a few hours. And many steps together. And also, we have inherent information problem. So in times of emergency, of acute emergency, not even the administration and the government themselves don't usually have a reliable, properly analyzed and full information. In the general public and other institutions, civil society organization and so on, almost never has this reliable information in real time. Maybe after years, but not in real time. So maybe to recap, essentially in states of emergency, an organized society decides to take heightened internal risk to the regime, to address a great and imminent external danger like war, natural disaster, and so on. And it seems that the underlying assumption of this willingness to take the heightened internal risk is an assumption of sufficient democratic resilience. So it seems that the assumption is that we take a risk, but it's a hedged and calculated risk. Okay. Now, when states of emergency intersect with autocratization, so especially when states of emergency is declared happened during autocratization, we have a intensified, perhaps multiplied problems and risks. So these, or maybe I should say before that, each of these phenomena was studied separately, and we have substantial body of literature on states of emergency. We're all familiar with it, and massive burgeoning body of scientific literature about autocratization, especially in the last few years. It's immense, but really. But we have very little studies about the intersection. So an integrative analysis of states of emergency and autocratization, this is our study. And we had, I think, every reason to believe that this integrative approach, study them together, has special importance. In particular, shortly, in times of autocratization, we can't assume anymore. We can no longer assume democratic resilience as before, as we usually perceive it. In particular, we can't assume a government that is committed, that is first committed is to act lawfully, according to the law, to the common good. On the contrary, we know that they do just the opposite. They're committed to entrench the power, or entrench themselves in power. And we know that we entrust, we give the most powerful, unconventional weapons in the hands of autocratizers. It's not in the hands of a government, an abstract government, or an idealized government. It's a government led by autocratizers, with very few guarantees, intact guarantees. And we have a multiplied information and knowledge issues, right? Because the knowledge and information problems of autocratization meet and intensify, or expected to intensify, those of states of emergency. So that's very briefly, we can elaborate on those issues during the discussion. So how we designed our research to explore it. So first, it's a relatively high resolution research of 5 countries that you can see on the screen. First, we wanted to set the baseline, to have a good, solid common denominator between those countries. All should be typical and stable democracy. So we didn't want to have borderline cases or transitional regimes, rather unstable regimes in the making or the move. So the starting point should have been typical and stable democracies. To do that, we relied predominantly on the regime of the world index by VDEM, which is basically 10 categories. They classify all the countries in the world into one of 10 categories. 0 to 4 denote autocracies of different kinds. 5 to 9 denote democracies of various types. And so we chose countries that were 6 and above. So it's not 5, the lowest category of democracy, because we didn't want any borderline cases and doubts. So 6 and above, and democracy and at least 15 years democracy. So these were the first threshold criteria, quality and stability of democracy. Then the third threshold criteria were autocratization, so democracy that experienced autocratization, because that's the whole point, and diagnosed autocratization, and the sufficiency of academic sources, because this research relied mostly on secondary sources, and it was important for us to have a good, solid basis of literature, of academic literature, to analyze each country. So these were the four threshold criteria, and we have a sample of 5 countries. It may look a small sample, but if you consider all the countries that meet our criteria, it's not that small. And within the possible country, we chose 5 countries with diversity, with diverse constitutional background, including in the form of governance, parliamentary and presidential. We have 2 parliamentary, 2 presidential, and 1 Turkey that switched during the autocratization from parliamentary to presidential, but also diverse cultural and geographical or geopolitical characteristics. So this is how we created our sample, and now Daphne can continue with the real research.
Thanks, Nadav. So building on that conceptual framework, we'll now turn to the 5 countries at the heart of the research to see how these patterns play out in practice. So our first case study is South Korea, and it is a case illustrating a dramatic emergency rupture within an ongoing process of erosion. To understand the current crisis, we must look at the country's democratic journey. So following decades of authoritarian rule and military coups, South Korea underwent a high-quality democratization in 1987, and by 1997, it reached the very top tier of the VDEM ladder as a liberal democracy, a ranking it maintained until 2023. So historically, the authoritarian era from 1948 to 1987 was marked by repeated recourse to martial law to suppress dissent. But however, after 1987, democratic governments refrained from using these powers for decades. And even during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government relied on public health infrastructure rather than declaring a state of emergency, even when the country has been hit hard by the pandemic. Now, I'm moving to the process of gradual autocratization identified in our research. It began in 2013 and spanned successive administrations from both right and left-wing parties. It began with President Park, whose tenure was marked by the intimidation of critics, violating freedom of expression, and even claims of her planning to declare martial law to take over state institutions, which she didn't do. She was then followed by President Moon, who was noted for blurring the lines between law and politics through the significant judicial capture and the unprecedented appointment of sitting judges to senior executive roles. And then in 2022 came President Yoon. He was elected on promises to restore the rule of law, but has faced growing accusations of creating a prosecution dictatorship in Korea since he appointed loyalists to key positions within the prosecution and relied on them to persecute political rivals. His administration has been defined by executive overreach, frequent use of presidential veto on legislation, and a strengthened grip on the police force. This culminated in the martial law rupture on the dramatic night of December 3rd, 2024. On that night, President Yoon declared martial law in a dramatic televised broadcast, the first such declaration since 1987. And within minutes, military forces seized the Central Election Commission and moved towards the National Assembly. The martial law decree suspended parliament and political parties while taking control of the media. And President Yoon even ordered the military to take over parliament to prevent a vote to abolish his rule. So the struggle for survival that night was both dramatic and immediate. Thousands of citizens blocked armored vehicles with their bodies, and lawmakers from the opposition climbed fences to enter the buildings, while helicopters attempted to block them. Crucially, both the military and the police showed relative restraint, hesitating to arrest political leaders. And finally, in the middle of the night, the lawmakers voted to invalidate the martial law. In the aftermath of this, Parliament voted to impeach President Yoon, and he was arrested for insurrection. And most recently, in February of this year, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. While this attempt failed, the ongoing crisis led VDEM to downgrade South Korea to an electoral democracy for a year in the year of 2024. So it seems that in South Korea, democracy survived by the narrowest of margins, and it was blocked only by the swift parliamentary action and the heroic public resistance. And I should note here that among all the cases that we have studied, this is the only one where democracy actually remains standing despite the intersection of autocratization and a state of emergency. So maybe we can move now to India, where we see a different pattern. We see the strategic use of emergency powers to accelerate a long-term autocratization process. So India entered this period as a long-standing federal parliamentary democracy, the world's most populated, guided by the longest-written constitution in the world. Its system included an independent judiciary that since the 1970s has traditionally taken an expansive approach to protecting fundamental rights. That being said, India also has a significant history of emergency declarations. And it had declared a national emergency 3 times in 1962, in 1971, and most severely from 1975 to 1977. The latter period, known simply in India as the emergency, is seen by many scholars as a constitutional dictatorship under Indira Gandhi. At that time saw the arrest of tens of thousands of activists, strict media censorship, including cutting electricity to newspapers, and attempts to centralize powers through constitutional amendments. This is the national emergencies, and we see, other than that India also has what is known as the president's rule, which is a different mechanism that allows the central government to take over the functions of the different states that make up India. While this has been in use in India, in Indian history for over 125 times, we see that since the 1990s, its use has decreased due to Supreme Court rulings. So this is the emergency background, and now moving to the autocratization process. Under Prime Minister Modi, who's in power since 2014, autocratization has taken a more subtle but systematic form. After his party won an absolute majority in parliament, the government began influencing the judiciary by rejecting specific judge recommendations and strategically transferring critical judges between courts to sideline opposition from the bench. Researchers identify the year of 2017 as a turning point for the judicial system. While the Supreme Court was historically independent and even interventionist, as I mentioned, since 2017, it began to yield to government pressure on core constitutional issues. Other than judicial pressure, Modi has also sought to weaken parliament by concentrating power in the executive. The administration frequently uses presidential ordinances to bypass parliamentary debate. These are functionally similar to emergency powers, but they are strategically used by Modi for controversial issues that do not, in fact, require such an immediate action. And moreover, to keep these measures alive, these ordinances, the government tends to avoid parliamentary oversight by reissuing the ordinances or intentionally shorting parliamentary sessions. We also have seen a record-breaking increase in the suspension of opposition members, severely limiting their ability to act as a check on power. Now let's move to the emergency measures used by Modi. And the most striking example is the case of Jammu and Kashmir. That is, that in late 2018, a state of emergency was declared in that territory, followed by a total communication blackout and the deployment of 40,000 troops. Under the cover of this emergency, the government revoked the constitutional article that granted the region autonomous status and redefined it as a union territory that is under the direct central control. And researchers they tend to compare this move to the 1970s emergency. So this is one kind of move. And beyond Kashmir, the government has used anti-terror legislation, which has been expanded and used against human rights activists, academics, and lawyers. And it has also used ordinances to address highly controversial issues, as I mentioned, often to suppress dissent and to target minorities, specifically the Muslim minority in the country. So to summarize India, the Indian case shows how the full set of emergency and emergency-like procedures can expand executive power and fundamentally reorder a state's constitutional identity with an ongoing autocratizing process. So now let's move to our third case study, which is Hungary. Its democratic story begins with a peaceful transition from communism. And a key factor in that transition was a constitutional compromise. They decided that rather than writing a new constitution, the existing 1949 document should be heavily amended to establish a republic with a separation of powers and a strong constitutional court. And since 1990, Hungary established itself as a liberal democracy with frequent peaceful transitions of power, and it joined the EU in 2004. And before 2010, it sat at the very high end of the VDEM spectrum with meaningful constraints imposed by both the courts and European institutions. The turning point occurred, as I mentioned, in 2010 with Viktor Orban's victory, which granted his coalition a supermajority in parliament. Using this power, the parliament passed a new fundamental law in 2011 to replace the old constitution. And right after this rewriting, Orban turned to capturing the judiciary. In a notable move, the new constitution lowered the judicial retirement age from 70 to 62, forcing roughly 15% of the judges to retire immediately. And the government also packed the Constitutional Court and terminated the term of the Supreme Court president, who was critical of the reforms. Beyond the courts, there was a systematic media capture achieved by taking over the regulator and putting economic pressure on independent outlets while benefiting pro-government media. Academic and civil society freedom was also curtailed, most famously when the government forced the Central European University to leave the country. Public universities were also transferred to political appointees, and NGOs were increasingly investigated under the label of serving foreign interests. What's special about this process, or what's notable, is that it was fast, it was systematic, and it was heavily law-driven. And Hungary dropped from a liberal democracy in 2009 to an electoral autocracy by 2022. The emergency framework has been a central pillar of this autocratization. Since 2015, Hungary has been in a nearly continuous state of emergency, which the government transformed into a primary tool of governance. The fundamental law, which is the constitution, was systematically amended to expand executive power to act via decrees with minimal oversight. And the research identifies three key emergency states. The first was the immigration emergency, which started in 2015. And the government used regular legislation rather than constitutional provisions to create a state of crisis, which allowed it to rule by decrees. And this state of crisis has been extended every 6 months for over 8 years, long after the original crisis subsided, illustrating what we call the normalization of exception. The second state of emergency was the COVID-19 state of danger, where the parliament granted an open-ended mandate for decrees. Many of the decrees that were published were completely unrelated to health, such as stripping rights from asylum seekers or redirecting tax revenue away from opposition-led cities. Finally, as the COVID emergency was ending, the government found a new emergency, and it changed the constitution to allow for emergencies based on conflict in neighboring countries and not a conflict inside or directly affecting Hungary. And it was linked to the war in Ukraine. Under this state, the government has issued over 200 decrees, including nationalizing companies and imposing retroactive taxes. And the impact in Hungary is clear. Rule by decree has effectively marginalized parliament and replaced ordinary legislative processes. Emergency states are also weaponized rhetorically to cast political opponents, NGOs, and the EU as threats to national sovereignty. Because the Constitutional Court was already packed with loyalists by the time these emergencies began, there were no effective checks left to stop the misuse of these powers. And this is all obviously, before the current elections that we should see how they'll change Hungary. Okay, now let's move to Venezuela. There, for over 30 years, starting in 1958, it was a stable and recognized democracy, which is a notable exception in a region that was then dominated by autocratic rule and military coups. Its 1961 constitution was supported by a broad coalition of the military and business sectors. But that being said, the system had also faced severe challenges over the years, most notably in the 1980s following the collapse of oil prices, which triggered an economic crisis. Despite this ongoing unrest, the democratic system remained resilient initially, and in 1992 it even defeated a coup attempt led by then Colonel Hugo Chavez. But everything changed in 1999 when Chavez finally took office. He immediately issued a decree to hold a referendum for a new constituent assembly, a move that had no basis in the existing constitution. Before a new constitution was even finalized, this pro-Chavez assembly suspended parliament, fired judges, and replaced the head of the Electoral Council. What followed was a swift hijacking of state institutions. In 2000, the National Assembly passed an enabling law that allowed Chavez to rule by decree for a whole year, effectively transferring legislative power to presidency. And following widespread protests in 2002, which briefly removed him from office, Chavez returned with a vengeance, and he purged the military, replacing hundreds of officers with loyalists. The scale of this militarization is staggering. The number of generals increased from just 50 in 1993 to roughly 4,000 by 2016. And the military was also integrated into public administration, managing state factories, and even the national oil company, which is the country's most vital asset. Moving forward in time, under Nicolas Maduro, who took power in 2013, electoral distortions deepened. Even when the opposition was the one who won parliamentary majority in 2015, when the opposition won the parliamentary majority, the National Assembly was systematically paralyzed. And by the 2024 elections, independent observers showed a clear opposition victory, yet Maduro was declared the winner, effectively ending meaningful democratic competition in Venezuela. Now let's talk a little bit about the emergencies in that country. Our research identified 3 distinct patterns of emergency power there. First, there were general emergencies for like floods and electricity crisis. And while these might show a disregard for democratic foundations, they lack a direct instrumental link to the autocratization process itself. But more significant are the instrumental emergencies used to advance the autocratic agenda, and de facto emergency powers, which are situations where the government bypassed the separation of powers without formally declaring an emergency. We saw this early on with the purging of the military. Then, when the opposition, as I mentioned, won the 2015 parliamentary majority, the regime used emergency powers as a weapon of last resort. The Supreme Court, which acted as a tool of the rulers, stripped the National Assembly of its authority to oversee emergency declarations. And in 2017, 2 years later, the court itself was the one who declared a state of emergency, transferring parliamentary power to the president. Finally, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Maduro regime used emergency decrees to silence scientists and journalists who shared information about the virus, and strategically used lockdown measures to prevent protests over the ongoing economic collapse. So to sum up very shortly, emergency was a central tool used to centralize power from the very early stages of autocratization in the country. Finally, we move to our last case study, which is Turkey. Very briefly, it was established in 1923 as a secular nation state with an orientation toward Western democratic values. And historically, the Turkish military viewed itself as the guardian of this secular constitution, leading to multiple interventions over the years that marginalized civilian rule. The Constitutional Court was also traditionally strong and independent. And for much of its history, Turkey was classified as a stable electoral democracy, though it dropped at some points to autocratic levels during periods of direct military control. The turning point began in 2002 when the AKP, led by Erdogan, won a majority in parliament. His first term was marked by relative stability, but it included one crucial reform, which was subordinating the military to civilian control. While some saw this as a step of democratization, it can also be seen, maybe especially in hindsight, as a way to remove the military as an institutional barrier to future autocratization. Starting in 2008, the government launched massive investigations against officers for alleged coup plots, replacing them with loyalists. Simultaneously, the AKP also dismantled independent media. Another major turning point occurred in 2010 when a referendum allowed the government to control the judiciary. And indeed, by 2014, Turkey was no longer a democracy and was already classified as an electoral autocracy. However, the 2016 state of emergency was the ultimate catalyst. Following a failed coup attempt in July of that year, the government declared a nationwide emergency that lasted 2 years. While initially it was justified as a measure to fight terrorists, it was rapidly used to target the political opposition. And under the cover of emergency, approximately 150,000 people were arrested and another 130,000 public sector employees, including judges and academics, were dismissed. The primary tool of governance became emergency decrees issued by executive branch without parliamentary oversight. These were used to alter hundreds of laws unrelated to the coup, and they also provided the legal basis to shut media outlets and implement mass digital censorship. We also saw the systematic dismantling of local institutions, such as the academia, which was captured in Turkey when 15 universities were closed, over 6,000 faculty members were dismissed, and the internal election of university rectors was replaced by a centralized appointment system. Overall, more than all of this, the most profound change was the 2017 constitutional transformation. And while the state of emergency was still in effect, Turkey transformed into a presidential system with nearly unlimited power. The president gained the authority to issue decrees, prepare the budget, declare a state of emergency, and dissolve parliament. Finally, the state of emergency was allowed to expire in 2018 only because its extraordinary powers have been embedded into the new constitution. And we see that between 2018 and 2022, over 6,000 presidential decisions and over 100 decrees were issued, demonstrating that emergency rule has become a new standard of governance. Maybe we could go over the conclusions really quickly. So to wrap up, our comparative analysis confirms a central thesis. Emergency states and autocratization do not merely coincide. Instead, they're mutually reinforcing in a way that significantly aggravates the harm done to the democratic order. Through our research, we identified a 3-stage pattern of democratic breakdown. First, there's erosion, which is a gradual weakening of constitutional checks and norms and oversight institution. Then there's emergency, either formal emergency or its functional equivalents, which radically expand the executive's room for maneuver. And finally, consolidation, which is what we call the normalization of exception. This is where extraordinary powers help push forward the stabilization of an autocratic rule. As Nadav also mentioned, we found that emergency factors impact autocratization through 3 distinct operative channels, either formal emergency powers or functionally equivalent exceptional powers like presidential ordinances or anti-terror law, and finally, emergency rhetoric, which is also important to emphasize urgency, existential threat, and to justify radical changes. So what are the institutional and constitutional lessons? A realistic understanding of this synergism is essential for modern democratic defense. Our research suggests a few critical takeaways. First, what we see as substance over source. Our focus should not just be on whether a crisis is genuine or manufactured. The real issue is how the powers are used and which institutional safeguards remain operative during this crisis. And second, we need durable safeguards. The most vital democratic safeguards are those capable of remaining operational under conditions of emergency. Resilience must be measured by institutions' ability to function even when autocratizers attempt to bypass the law through the language of necessity. So thank you all for your attention, and maybe we should start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadav and Daphne. If anybody wants to join in, please ask a question. Please raise your hand. Maybe we can stop the screen share if you would. So I will briefly just ask a question. I see O is also raising his hand. So I want to start by saying thank you very much for the innovative research that tries to look at the relationship between autocratization and emergencies. And for the empirical research, which is interesting in the sense that you've identified the 5 jurisdictions that you have and try to dig deeper. I have a couple of questions, but I will only use one because I want to get the conversation going. So my question is methodological. You seem to lump all emergencies together, regardless of whether they have anything to do with autocratization or not. In other words, it's unclear what is the dependent and independent variables, so to speak. One hypothesis is that if you have a process of autocratization, then there will be greater tendency to use unrelated emergencies as pretexts to aggrandize the executive. And if this is the case, then you want to take 2 jurisdictions, one within the process of autocratization and one not, and assume that the emergency facing them is the same, let's say the corona, and then see what happens. In one, you would assume, because it's undergoing process of autocratization, you would see more aggrandizement. And on the other, you will see more, as Daphne said, checks on the processes of aggrandization. Okay, so that's hypothesis 1 that says, oh, if you have processes, then they're going to be used either as pretext or maybe just because the autocracy views its role to defend the public and is less restricted, etc. We can have talk. But this is not what you're doing. You seem to be suggesting of this mutual reinforcement business. You seem to be suggesting that irrespective of the nature of the emergency, once emergency comes in autocratization, you will find greater or more rapid democratic decline or something of that nature. And here, I'm not sure that we can necessarily draw this conclusion without looking closer into the nature of the emergency. In South Korea, for example, the emergency was because the head of state then thought that the opposition was blocking all democratic ways of passing the budget and other things. And then he said, well, I got to declare a state of emergency. And lo and behold, the opposition said, no, we're not going to accept this. And the question is whether...
And part of his party. A few members of his party.
Yeah, a few members of his party as well. Yes, thank you for the correction. You're right. It wasn't just clear, which is actually interesting. It wasn't just on party lines. There were also, which is an interesting indication. We can talk about this later. I think you're right. I think it's important. But I think this is highly different than the case of India, for example. I'm putting Hungary aside, but on the case of India, where there is war in the 70s and also in Kashmir, these are situations of war. And I don't think, I'm having trouble necessarily putting those emergencies by saying all emergencies are the same, they just fuel processes of autocratization no matter what. So I was wondering whether, maybe this is just maybe I'm not getting something. Maybe you just thought about it and I'm not seeing it, but maybe you can say more about the relationship between those two concepts that you've been studying. Now I have more questions, but I see also now Nadiv, and so I will stop here, and then please, Nadav and Daphne, please.
Okay. Yeah. So first, it's always a great question. Should be the preliminary question. What is it exactly that we're looking into? And here I have to say that maybe some scholars would go. I mean, we presented here for the first time, but theoretically would go even one step backwards and think, well, you started by falling into the bias of autocratization, because what many researchers, us included, do is to look at and we clearly stated it, to look or to observe this specific group of autocratizing countries, right? And perhaps if you, depending on what you want to look into, you should actually examine countries that succeeded in preventing it or blocking it on time. So their institutions acted properly. Their institutions contained states of emergency within democratic countries, despite of perhaps ambitions of the politicians, of the government to abuse the emergency. But what we tried to do here is quite a modest move, and maybe I should have clarified it more explicitly. So we said that we go for an integrative investigation of these two phenomena together, but in fact, eventually our conclusions refer to one direction. So how states of emergency affect autocratization, and not necessarily the other directions of how states of how autocratization affects emergency management and so on.
That was my second question, but we'll get to it in the future.
Okay. So I'm just it was a kind of prophetical.
Prophetic, yes.
So and actually we suggest that we don't go as far as saying that every emergency, bogus or genuine or artificial, is necessarily going to cause specific effect. What we did say, and we can say it with confidence, that in each and every country, states of emergency or their equivalents were used and played a significant role in autocratization. So it's a powerful tool that was exercised strategically and effectively. So regarding the weights of different variables, so perhaps like it's likely that in some circumstances other variables can further intensify the effect of emergency on the regime, on autocratization, or perhaps to some extent counter it. We don't deny that, but so I hope this is at least a partial answer to your comment. So our conclusion in this regard is fairly modest. We say that we can see, as a matter of fact, not just as a hypothesis or a conclusion, states of emergency did play an important role in different phases and different versions in each and every one of those countries. That's as far as we go.
Daphne, you wanted to add something?
No, I agree with Nadav. We see like the centrality of emergency was different between the countries that we researched, and you pointed it out that I think India is maybe a bit different, but I agree with Nadav with what he said, so nothing to add.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the interesting and timely subject. And I think maybe for me, like the biggest question, you talk about Hungary, and I think in the table you said it's like no longer democratic. So I think so. The last table. I wonder if you talk about, and I don't know if it's in the scope of your paper, the reversibility of the autocratization process, because now Hungary is kind of like an example of I don't still know of what, but
Not yet.
Refutation is the theory.
Let's wait.
Yeah, but for now, a place where we thought a lot of
for
scholars
short.
thought democracy is lost, and suddenly, I thought about Adam Shaborsky's definition of democracy. Democracy is where political parties loses elections. So yeah, so do you say anything about this in your paper? Do you have kind of, I don't know.
Yeah. So
Sorry. Maybe I'll start.
Yeah,
Nadav.
for both. Sorry.
I think this is this particular question is out of the scope of our paper. How to get back from autocracy. If I can just say something about that, I agree with Nadav, who said that it's way too early for us to know what's going on in Hungary, and I also, again, it's out of the scope of our paper. Our paper was more modest than that, but I don't know about the how you define democracy. If I can agree with that, I don't know if it's enough to just see Orban lose the elections in Hungary to say that it's a democracy. It's just too early to say, I think. And Nadav?
Yeah, so I just want to add that maybe a broader comment. The definition of democracy is absolutely pivotal, right? In any way. In our view, which is, I think, the accepted view at least in democratic studies nowadays, Hungary belongs to a type of regime usually called electoral, according to Videm, electoral autocracy, and others would call it competitive authoritarianism. It means that there is some sort of political competition, and the consequence is that theoretically, the ruling party can be replaced in peaceful elections. It is highly unlikely. The elections are not fair anyway, and sometimes not entirely free. But there is an elections, and there are real elections in the sense that the ballots are really counted, reliably counted. The thing is, So in that sense, a victory of the opposition is unlikely, it's remote, it's extremely more difficult than in democracies, in functioning democracies, constitutional democracies with checks and balances, with independent institution, electoral management body, bodies of elections management, and independent courts, and the rule of law, and free civil society organization, and so on, and media, and so on. But it can happen. It can happen in rarely, with prodigious efforts, and so on, but it can happen. So it's not a challenge to the concept. Okay, it's not a conceptual challenge. Maybe we can leave it here and
Nadav.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much. Daphne, welcome. I'm so happy to see you here.
Nice to see you.
I have some comments. First of all, not a comment. I think that Amnon's comments are just showing what the wonderful work you did until now in composing this research. To my knowledge, I'm not familiar with a paper that compound a 5-case study comparative work about emergency and autocratization. So first of all, many congratulations for that. I have a theoretical comment and then a rejoinder to Amnon, and then just a small comment. Theoretically speaking, you went for embracing the concept of autocratization, which is totally legit. And I felt while reading the theoretical part that you are aware to the existence of the democratic backsliding paradigm, but you abandoned it a little bit towards more loyalty to the main concept. Now, autocratization was there before and is highly used, but I think that there are some nuance between the two. Most particularly, I think what Baremo was innovating in the backsliding paradigm is that we are capturing government in legal tools and Kim and so on and so forth. So it may be a good, due to that, you are dealing with emergency and emergency implementations. So it may be the case that it would be good to refine the discussion there. This is the first comment. Secondly, I'm joining Amnon when saying that in each and every case study, you have different mechanisms of emergency. You have the classic constitutional one, you have the rule by decree, you have the ethnic oppressive emergency, and so on and so forth. And to my view, this is a challenge. This is a good thing, because now what you can do is try to conceptualize and try to deepen the analysis and ask questions like when we will see this one and when we will see that one. So, for example, a rule by decree, not actually the classic declaration of emergency, but the rule by decree is something that we are now seeing extensively. So it might be a good idea to go with this one and try to conceptualize or generalize. But I think that this is the next stage in my view for this research. And the last comment, I just wanted to connect you to a discussion that now is being held in the American theory of emergency. And recently, I think I sent it to Nadav. Recently, David Landau has just published actually an exact piece like you did, but only specifically within the American context. And he's kind of promoting the same thrust of your arguments, meaning that there is a correlation and let's see how it's going on and so on and so forth. And this paper is engaging within a literature over there, which also makes the opposite argument, saying something like, listen, emergency became normal and it's kind of okay that it is normal. So let's do some accommodations, but grosso modo, we are not against it. People like Elena Chechko and others. So it may be, first of all, write David and send him if you have an English version. You might publish together. But I think that it might be useful for you to try to take not David's work, but the others that he's dealing with and try to confront your conclusions with their work, because it's not in the context of autocratization, it's in the context of policy, and it might challenge your conclusion. But great work, and IDI, go IDI always. So
Thanks,
Thank you,
Nadav.
Nadav. Daphne.
Maybe I'll just start with us choosing the term autocratization, although probably Nadav has a little bit more to say. But I think we were thinking about it, if to say autocratization or democratic backsliding or erosion. How are they different? What do they mean? And I think we chose autocratization to show the continuum, to show the trend that it's going away from democracy. I think this was something that's important to us, to show that they're not all in the same place. The emergency didn't start when they were democratically the same. So I think that was one thing. And about the US, I think this is more for Nadav, but I think I'm ready for us to start researching the US as well. And we just saw that they lost, that they went down the VDEM ladder. So maybe it's time for us to go into it. So thank you.
Yeah, just it's a whole debate. There's a quite extensive conceptual debate, mostly from the side of the autocratization camp. But there's a whole lot of problems with democratic backsliding, starting with the process and the continuum that Daphne mentioned. Because what happened, first of all, it's not, right? The backsliding is not democratic, right? Then what happens when it crosses the threshold of regime change? Now it's autocratic, so are we still, but the process remains, it's the same process, the same movement. So now, are we calling it differently? So we can say, okay, now it's not a democratic backsliding anymore. Now it's a autocratic consolidation or entrenchment, or this kind of or authoritarian entrenchment.
I think the only idiosyncrasy is about using the law and the constitution as a mechanism, implementing law in order to capture government. This, I think, still does some work, but I totally agree that that's okay. It's not.
Okay, maybe we can hear some more. I'm sorry to jump in because we have we are 15 minutes, and I want to allow the conversation forward.
Sure.
So I have Benny and then Adi. Benny, please.
Hi, Nadav. Hi, Daphne. Very interesting talk, and it's good to see the fine grain analysis of each regime. But I was also thinking about following Amnon and Nadav, and I was also thinking about the making more fine grain of thinking about the different emergencies, but also thinking about the real life mechanism, how autocrats use these different mechanisms and different social experiences in different societies, is to use a mechanism in order to gain more power and to make within the autocratization move. And the reason I thought about it is also because thinking about how to prevent it. Because I'm a legal scholar, I'm thinking about the normative and how to also to prevent, and not only to describe, but also what to do about it. And what to do, we can think about these points or these leverages that the autocrats use, and how to where to put their checks and balances in order so they won't use it. And that's and I think is the South Korean case is a good case to maybe to delve in and think of okay, they managed to prevent it. And we want to, let's say, think of a way to redesign the checks and balances. And so how come it worked in South Korea and it didn't work elsewhere? Or what happens there? And what mechanism can we use for in favor of the democracy?
Okay, maybe you could
Okay,
answer
great.
briefly because we have, yeah.
So thank you, Benny. Very valid and good point. I'd like to stress just a few things. First, we think that we were able to show that the emergency effect is significant regardless of cultural and social characteristics, or at least in our sample, in our research countries, but one should also account for the differences, right? So it might be that those cultural, and it's probable, right, that those cultural and social differences played some role, some part in the different forms of use of emergency, and also the consequences and final results. And so that's a good point. I'd like to say that although cultural factors are undoubtedly significant, in my view at least, they prove to be much less significant than previously thought. There were all those theories of, Venezuela and Hungary, they were all young and without democratic culture. It can't happen in the United States, neither in the United Kingdom, never. And because they have culture, emancipating culture from generation to generation, and so the whole bunch of theories, and they proved wrong. That's, and with regard to South Korea, it's a good subject for further study, excellent one. I'd like to dig deeper into South Korea as well. But my hunch or educated guess is that you can find good explanations for this outlying effect of South Korea that remained democracy. And by the way, in this year of IDEM that was published just 2 weeks ago or something like that, they regain the previous category of 9 of the highest category of democracy. But I think that this case can be explained by theory of autocracy and states of emergency. So maybe we should hear Adi, and if we have time, I can elaborate on my theory.
Thank you, Adi. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. Hi, thank you so much. This is really, I'm stuck again.
We can hear you though.
We can hear you.
Okay, sorry, my internet is a mess. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about correlation versus causation. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what emergencies are just correlated and what is maybe created by the governments, exaggerated by the governments, if there's a way to show it. I was also interested whether you can say a little bit about emergencies that are not being grabbed and maybe why is that? For example, we can say that climate emergencies are very real, but it makes sense maybe for governments to just disregard them versus other emergencies. So maybe it touches a bit on Amnon's question, and not only like mixing different types of emergencies, but also picking like what emergencies do we want to grab and why? And I was just wondering if you had some like thoughts about that.
Okay, so Or brought up the definition of democracy, and now we have to to pour over the definition of states of emergency and whether the climate crisis is a state of emergency. So according to the classic theory of emergency, it won't be considered emergency, but like the climate change as a phenomena, because it's not imminent, it's not time delimited. You can handle it with the normal procedure and conventions and institutions of the state. Just legislate. So you don't need the emergency to be swift, decisive, and so maybe. But so it's a question whether or not it's emergency. Regardless of that, I'll just put it aside for a moment. It's an excellent question about the emergency not exploited, or at least that we couldn't establish a significant and clear connection to autocratization. So I think it's a wonderful subject for further research. In the scope and methods of our research. So, for example, in Venezuela, we said explicitly that, and Daphne said it during the presentation, that there were some emergencies with regard to electricity and mud and things like that they declared emergency, whether regional or national, but we couldn't establish a clear and strong connection, causal connection or fractional connection to autocratization. And I think that a main reason for that is that, as I said earlier, we relied on secondary academic sources, and where the academic sources in Venezuela on emergencies and autocratization, authored by experts, usually Venezuelan experts, and they don't ascribe any importance to these events. They just mention them. We didn't have the appropriate means, like scientific means to handle it and just focus on those phenomena that were very few, I have to say, very few, that we saw, that we could identify emergency not blatantly used. But it's an excellent point for further research, and thank you.
Maybe I could add really briefly two really good questions, and about the emergencies not exploited. I have to say that I was not thinking about it at all when I did the research, so I don't have an answer, but I think that maybe we saw that a lot of the emergencies, the regime needed like an enemy, and that they found it in migrants or minorities and stuff like that, and maybe environment is just not like a real enemy that can be exploited. And about like correlation and causation, we were thinking about it a lot, and I don't think we have a good way to know what was like caused by the ruler and what was real, other than COVID was the only thing that really was like all over the world. And then we looked for other emergencies as well, because COVID is such a thing that goes all around the world, and it was real. And I just want to say that I think the elephant in the room for me is Israel, that is not included in our study. And I think it's an interesting question also thinking about Israel, but again, it was not in our study, and hopefully it will be one day. So thank you.
Okay, so I see Michael here. We have 3 more minutes. So Michael, please.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. Really interesting. I really like the case descriptions. I think they're very informative, interesting in themselves. The categorization part, I'm less inclined to like categorization, broad categorizations, but it's an interest. It gives interesting insights if someone's into this kind of work. The only thing I'm struggling with is the bottom line. What's new about this? Because I mean, if you look at historically about emergency powers, okay, so you can go back all the way to the Roman Republic, right, where they would concentrate powers, right, and they would appoint an autocrat in order to respond effectively, right, to increase the effectiveness of rule during certain emergency crisis situations. Okay, and so this is something that has been discussed for like the expansion of powers and the risks of and the dangers of that to democracies for a very, very, very long time. There's a lot of writing and a lot of debates about it, right? And then people who draft constitutions, for example, they think about these things. They talk about them, they consider them, and they try to build democratic systems that can prevent that on the one hand, that somehow find a good balance between individual rights in emergency, right, and the ability of the government to respond effectively to the emergency in order to put in whatever you want there to save lives, for example. Okay, so my question is, what's the bottom line in terms of what's new about what you're saying beyond the interesting description and the categories that you use in terms of autocratization or the specific descriptive aspect of the process leading in different cases to autocratization?
In 1 minute, not to.
Yeah, we started a bit. We took our time for people to join. We can still 3-4 minutes for a.
So a few fundamental differences. First, contemporary democracies reject the Roman idea of dictatorship. So they don't. They disagree with that. Our system, the democratic family, not just in Israel, is completely disparate, different. We don't have dictatorship. We don't bring a wholly new institution, a dictator for a limited period of time. We use the executive, the permanent institution, and also I think that we show how emergency endanger democracies nowadays, which is through or in combination with autocratization and not separately, not independently. I'm not familiar with cases of democracy, of healthy democracies in our criteria that went down purely by a state of emergency. Like suddenly a dictator used the state of emergency and toppled democracy. It happens through autocratization or in combination with autocratization. So I think this is the value of our research compared with previous.
I think this is a wonderful position or place to end this very interesting.
There's a question by Mustafa in the chat.
Okay. So Mustafa, please ask your question.
Thank you so much. I know we are in short of time, but it's very quick. Thank you so much for interesting presentation for both our colleague. The question mostly like we all have this question if government act in emergency way, even without declaring the an emergency. How can we distinguish or where we can find when this is a normal crisis respond and when it become a move toward a non-democratic, in the other word, rules, like in which point we can distinguish one from another.
So distinguish normal, justified, emergency regime from one that is part of process of autocratization.
Maybe I can jump in because I think that could also serve as a sort of a conclusion, because goes to the other, we don't have time for this, but goes to the other direction. You could say that emergencies by definition push you towards a degree of autocratization just because, as you said, this is what you need. You need to decrease some measures of democracy in order to respond to an external crisis. Now, if the crisis is not external but internal, then of course you have a loop that reinforces itself. Mustafa asks, how can you distinguish? Maybe by separating them in your research, by saying, okay, this is war and pandemic on the one hand, and other types of emergencies on the other hand, then maybe you can say something about this. But I just want to join in to introduce the work of our colleague Stefan Vogt, who said it can work the other way. Sometimes emergencies allow you to move away from autocracies because they allow you to energize democratic forces and say, enough of this. So maybe you want to say, just in your 1 minute of conclusion each, where do you think we should go from here?
Okay, and by the way, there's another study that I don't now remember to cite, but shows that even in those cases where states of emergency can accelerate or maybe even generate democratization, there's a very short, narrow windows of opportunity to do that. So, and also it depends on many variables that we can't really understand and predict before. So where do we go from here? I think that in two directions. So we have the Minevra project on cascading. So this is the first part of your comments. And at the Institute and in many other places and research institutions, people are trying to identify and make progress with regard to democratic rehabilitation or recovery. So how do we do that? What are the anchors that we can use to get there? So it's, in a sense, it's a direct continuation of our research, and they're both like closing the cycle.
Daphne?
Yeah, I agree. I think this discussion was very useful for us to think more fine-grainedly about the different emergencies, and I think we need to further think about that. And I agree, maybe we're on the verge of like world democratic rehabilitation, and I need to think more about this and emergencies, how these can help. So
on this positive note of rehabilitation of democracy and other aspects of our lives, I would like to say thank you, and I apologize for us running 5 or 6 minutes late. Usually we try to finish on time, but that was an interesting topic, of course. I want to thank you all for participating in this interesting Minerva meeting, and invite you all, Michal, to our next. When will be our next? What is next on the agenda?
In 2 weeks from now, it will be with, wait a minute, I forgot his name, and it will not be recorded. So if you want to be there, it will be very interesting. Naor Bar-Zeev from WHO. He will talk about rapidly changing global vaccinology landscape and rising strategic risks.
Thank you very much.
Very interesting.
See you in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you all for your time.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Very useful comments.